and, before it had ceased to vibrate, there drove up a handsome cabriolet, out of which leaped Sir Mulberry Hawk and his friend Lord Frederick. "They are here now," said Kate, rising and hurrying away. "Miss Nickleby!" cried Mrs. Wycherley, perfectly aghast at the companion's attempting to quit the room without her permission first had been obtained. "Pray don't think of going." "You are very good," replied Kate, "but—" "For goodness' sake don't agitate me by making me speak so much," said Mrs. Wycherley, with great sharpness. "Dear me, Miss Nickleby, I beg—" It was in vain for Kate to protest that she was unwell, for the footsteps of the knockers, whoever they were already on the stairs. She resumed her seat, and had scarcely done so, when the doubtful page darted into the room and announced Mr. Pyke and Mr. Pluck, and Lord Frederick Versprott, and Sir Mulberry Hawk, all in at one burst. "The most extraordinary thing in the world," said Pluck, saluting both ladies with the utmost cordiality, "the most extraordinary thing. As Lord Frederick and Sir Mulberry drove up to the door, Pyke and I had that instant knocked." "That instant knocked," said Pyke. "No matter how you came, so that you are here," said Mrs. Wycherley, who, by dint of lying on the same sofa for 3 years and a half, had got up a little pantomime of graceful attitudes, and now threw herself into the most striking of the series, to astonish the visitors. "I am delighted, I am sure." "And how is Miss Nickleby?" said Sir Mulberry Hawk, accosting Kate in a low voice, not so low, however, but that it reached the ears of Mrs. Wycherley. "Why, she complains of suffering from the fright last night," said the lady. "I am sure I don't wonder at it, for my nerves are quite torn to pieces." "And yet you look," observed Sir Mulberry, turning round, "and yet you look—" "Beyond everything," said Mr. Pyke, coming to his patron's assistance. Of course Mr. Pluck said the same. "I am afraid Sir Mulberry is a flatterer, my lord," said Mrs. Wycherley, turning to that young gentleman, who had been sucking the head of his cane in silence, and staring at Kate. "Oh, devilish!" replied the lord, having given utterance to which remarkable sentiment, he occupied himself as before. "Neither does Miss Nickleby look the worse," said Sir Mulberry, bending his bold gaze upon her. "She was always handsome, but upon my soul, ma'am, you seem to have imparted some of your own good looks to her besides." To judge from the glow which suffused the poor girl's countenance after this speech, Mrs. Wycherley might, with some show of reason, have been supposed to have imparted to it some of that artificial bloom which decorated her own. Mrs. Wycherley admitted, though not with the best grace in the world, that Kate did look pretty. She began to think, too, that Sir Mulberry was not quite so agreeable a creature as she had at first supposed him, for although a skilful flatterer is a most delightful companion if you can keep him all to yourself, his taste becomes very doubtful when he takes to complimenting other people. "Pyke," said the watchful Mr. Pluck, observing the effect which the praise of Mrs. Nickleby had produced. "Well, Pluck," said Pyke. "Is there anybody," demanded Mr. Pluck mysteriously, "anybody you know, whom Mrs. Wycherley's profile reminds you of?" "Reminds me of?" answered Pyke. "Of course there is." "Who do you mean?" said Pluck, in the same mysterious manner. "The D. of B.?" "The C. of B.," replied Pyke, with the faintest trace of a grin lingering in his countenance. "The beautiful sister is the Countess, not the Duchess." "True," said Pluck. "The C. of B. The resemblance is wonderful." "Perfectly startling," said Mr. Pyke. Here was the state of things. Mrs. Wycherley was declared, upon the testimony of 2 veracious and competent witnesses, to be the very picture of a countess. This was one of the consequences of getting into good society. Why, she might have moved among grovelling people for 20 years and never heard of it. How could she, indeed? What did they know about countesses? The 2 gentlemen, having, by the greediness with which this little bait was swallowed, tested the extent of Mrs. Wycherley's appetite for adulation, proceeded to administer that commodity in very large doses, thus affording to Sir Mulberry Hawk an opportunity of pestering Miss Nickleby with questions and remarks, to which she was absolutely obliged to make some reply. Meanwhile, Lord Frederick enjoyed unmolested the full flavour of the gold knob at the top of his cane, as he would have done to the end of the interview if Mr. Wycherley had not come home and caused the conversation to turn to his favourite topic. "My lord," said Mr. Wycherley, "I am delighted, honoured, proud. Be seated again, my lord, pray. I am proud, indeed, most proud." It was to the secret annoyance of his wife that Mr. Wycherley said all this, for, although she was bursting with pride and arrogance, the illustrious guests believed that their visit was quite a common occurrence, and that they had lords and baronets to see them every day in the week. But Mr. Wycherley's feelings were beyond the power of suppression. "It is an honour indeed," said Mr. Wycherley. "Julia, my soul, will you suffer for this tomorrow?" "Suffer!" cried Lord Frederick. "The reaction, my lord, the reaction," said Mr. Wycherley. "This violent strain upon the nervous system over, my lord, what ensues? A sinking, a depression, a lowness, a lassitude, a debility. My lord, if Sir Tumley Snuffim was to see that delicate creature in this moment, he would not give a this for her life." In illustration which remark, Mr. Wycherley took a pinch of snuff from his box and jerked it lightly into the air as an emblem of instability. "Not that," said Mr. Wycherley, looking about him with a serious countenance. "Sir Tumley Snuffim would not give that for Mrs. Wycherley's existence." Mr. Wycherley told this with a kind of sober exultation, as if it were no trifling distinction for a man to have a wife in such a desperate state, and Mrs. Wycherley sighed and looked on as if she felt an honour, but had determined to bear it as meekly as might be. "Mrs. Wycherley," said her husband, "is Sir Tumley Snuffim's favourite patient. I believe I may venture to say that Mrs. Wycherley is the first person who took the new medicine which is supposed to have destroyed a family in Kensington gravel pits. I believe she was. If I am wrong, Julia, my dear, you will correct me." "I believe I was," says Mrs. Wycherley, in a faint voice. As there appeared to be some doubt in the mind of the patron how he could best join in this conversation, the indefatigable Mr. Pyke threw himself on to the breach, and, by way of saying something to the point, inquired, with reference to the aforesaid medicine, whether it was nice. "No, sir, it was not. It had not even that recommendation," said Mr. W. "Mrs. Wycherley is quite a martyr," observed Pyke, with a complimentary bow. "I think I am," said Mrs. Wycherley, smiling. "I think you are, my dear Julia," replied her husband, in a tone which seemed to say that he was not vain, but still must insist upon their privileges. "If anybody, my lord," added Mr. Wycherley, wheeling round to the nobleman, "will produce to me a greater martyr than Mrs. Wycherley, all I can say is, that I shall be glad to see that martyr, whether male or female. That is all, my lord." Pyke and Pluck promptly remarked that certainly nothing could be fairer than that, and the call having been by the time protracted to the very length, they obeyed Sir Mulberry's look, and rose to go. This brought Sir Mulberry himself and Lord Frederick to their legs also. Many protestations of friendship, and expressions anticipative of the pleasure which must inevitably flow from so happy an acquaintance, were exchanged, and the visitors departed, with renewed assurances that at all times and seasons the mansion of the Wycherleys would be honoured by receiving them beneath its roof. That they came at all times and seasons, that they dined there one day, supped the next, dined again on the next, and were constantly to and fro on all, that they made parties to visit public places, and met by accident at lounges, that upon all these occasions Miss Nickleby was exposed to the constant and unremitting persecution of Sir Mulberry Hawk, who now began to feel his character, even in the estimation of his two dependents, involved in a successful reduction of her pride, that she had no intervals of peace or rest, except at those hours when she could sit in her solitary room and weep over the trials of the day. All these were consequences naturally flowing from the well-laid plans of Sir Mulberry, and their able execution by the auxiliaries, Pyke and Pluck. And thus, for a fortnight, matters went on. That any but the weakest and silliest of people could have seen in one interview that Lord Frederick Verisopht, though he was a lord, and Sir Mulberry Hawk, though he was a baronet, were not persons accustomed to be the best possible companions, and were certainly not calculated by habits, manners, tastes, or conversation to shine with any very great lustre in the